Hail hail and welcome to part 6 of the Celtic History podcast series, which charts the history of Celtic Football Club from 1887 to the current day. In part 5 of the series, titled Apathy and Protest, Chris was joined by Marty Flynn from the Belfast Celtic Society, and they covered the period from 1940 to 1950. At the beginning of this decade, the world was at war, and Celtic faced a number of tough challenges to maintain their standing in Scottish football. The number of trophies is scarce, which wasn't helped by the lack of ambition of the Celtic board, with their refusal to use guest players stationed in Scotland during the war years. The first and second managerial changes occur through this era, at a time when the club faced a battle to avoid relegation in the final match of the 1947-48 season. We hear tales of legendary names such as Bobby Evans, Jock Weir, goalkeeper Willie Miller, as well as the emergence of stars such as John McPhail and Charlie Tully. The boys highlight the boardroom struggles at this time, and how a lady in Ireland came to be the major shareholder in the club. There are even more conspiracy theories, as Celtic are unfairly treated by both the SFA and the referees around this time. There are details of a playing kit worn through the 1940s, the songs sung by the fans at the time, stories of Celtic memorabilia, all mixed with more fan stories and confessions.
And by 1940, halfway through the season, or even a third of the way through the season, Celtic were in major trouble.
For the first time since the beginning of the club, we had a change of manager.
Mail would be replaced at Parkhead in February 1940 by Alloa manager Jimmy McStay.
McStay was, a gentleman steeped in the Celtic traditions.
McStay would discover the fact of his sacking, not from the board, but by reading about his dismissal in the press while on holiday.
So a lot of the really good players that emerged in the early 50s and stuff were all unearthed by Jimmy McStay.
It appears that the two big favourites then were A Nation Once Again and God Save Ireland.
Celtic, however, never used guest players and preferred to stick to their own talent than rely on other inconsistent arrangements.
Stanley Matthews, Matt Busby, they were all in and around Glasgow at the time. What you're going to see emerge in the 40s are the problems that beset this club for the next 25 years. This disgrace to our club over this period really shouldn't have been.
And my favourite game would probably be when we beat Real Madrid in 1982 in the European Cup.
There was disgraceful refereeing decisions taking place against Celtic. Celtic were in the eyes of the fans being kept down. Probably says more about the Celtic fans than anything else. The fact that they're not afraid to stand up for their club.
As well as everybody wanting to go to the games, they like the souvenirs and collectible items that go with it.
The other real hero was Willie Miller, the great goalkeeper of the time.
The legendary Jimmy McGrory had been recruited as manager from Kilmarnock. The SFA astonishingly ordered the closure of Celtic Park for an entire month.
There was this myth that this wee old woman in Ireland owned Celtic. People brushed the 40s off. It was a terrible time, there was a war on. There was a war on for Celtic.
Where the Celtic away kit was an all-white shirt with a green shamrock adoring the left breast.
For people who don't know, Celtic were almost relegated, and so he went to Belfast Celtic at last, and not only did he take Charlie Tully, but he also went for Jimmy Jones.
And then to end the night, the team, I think it was some of the players, jumped out the big cake that came on the stage with the League Championship and the Scottish Cup.
Now we join Chris McGuigan for part 6 of the series, where he will cover the period of 1950 to 1960 with his guest, from Celtic Quick News, Mr. Paul Brennan.
Those bigots from the SFA were plain to be seen. They tried to take away our flag of orange, white and green. The banners there's Sir Robert says in answer to our call. He said Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic overall.
Chapter 6. Celtic Football Club, 1950 to 1960. The arrival of the 1950s offered little cause for optimism amongst the Celtic support. The demise of this once dominant club had accelerated during the bleak war years of the early 1940s. No one expected football to continue as normal while conflict raged across the globe. But while most teams worked hard to maintain standards, the custodians at Parkhead neglected their duty and gambled with the very future of the club. The post-war resumption of competitive football underlined the depths Celtic had plunged. While Rangers remained Scotland's premier club, their supremacy was now challenged by an exciting Hibernian side. The Easter Road team would claim 2 league titles during the early years of the new decade, while the Celts wallowed in mid-table obscurity. Celtic were not devoid of talent, and men like Charlie Tully and Bobby Collins, the boys possessed players of significant ability. But a dire lack of leadership and consistency meant success remained distant. Manager Jimmy McGrory was little more than a compliant figurehead, with a real power, for matters on and off the pitch, resting with chairman Robert Kelly. Born in 1902, the son of Celtic's first captain James, Robert Kelly was appointed to the Celtic board in 1932, following the death of his father. He would remain a director for 15 years, before in 1947 he became chairman. Kelly's firm belief that Celtic continued to play in an attacking and entertaining manner was widely applauded, as was his decision to educate his coaching staff and players with trips to the 1953 England v Hungary International and the 1954 World Cup. Not so welcome, though, was the chairman's meddling in team selection. By the start of the 1950s, it was an open secret that Kelly had final approval of the team, and his ill-considered interference did little to encourage the return of silverware to Parkhead. It was perhaps somewhat surprising then that Celtic's long wait for a major honour finally came to an end in April 1951, as the Hoops lifted the Scottish Cup. A solitary strike from John McPhail was enough to seal victory over Motherwell at Hampden. For most of the near 132,000 crowd, the triumph was a source of great joy and relief. Celtic's cup form had been fine, but in truth, there was little to suggest a sudden return to the glory days of the past was imminent. In the league, the team remained also-rans, a mediocre outfit, seemingly incapable of sustaining a serious title challenge. There was, however, nothing mediocre about the Hoops' support. Despite the Parkhead faithful's frustrations, their devotion to the cause was unbroken. The boys remained one of the game's biggest box office attractions. Indeed, it was gate receipts rather than football prowess which ensured Celtic an invite to compete in a unique one-off competition in the late spring of 1953. The Coronation Cup would celebrate the ascendancy to the throne of Queen Elizabeth II. The tournament featured the top clubs from England and Scotland and would be held along similar lines to the Empire Exhibition Trophy of 1938. Celtic, who had just finished a lowly 8th in the league, would be joined in the tournament by champions Rangers, runners-up Hibernian, and a talented Aberdeen side. England were represented by their champions Arsenal and the famed powers of Manchester United, Tottenham Hotspur and Newcastle United. The boys faced Arsenal in the opening tie, and roared on by a 60,000 Hampden crowd, they shocked the English champions with a deserved 1-0 victory after Bobby Collins had scored direct from a corner. The Hoops had totally dominated the Gunners, and they took their surprisingly excellent form into the semi-final with Manchester United. The Old Trafford side simply had no answer to a rejuvenated Celtic, and goals from Bertie Peacock and new signer Neil Mockin secured a 2-0 win and booked the boys a shock final place. For that final on May the 20th, the slopes of Hampden would be shrouded in green, as Celtic faced the impressive Hibernian. Thousands were locked outside as 117,000 fans crowded on the terraces. Hibs, a wonderful attacking team, had reached the final with victories against Tottenham and Newcastle. Celtic would begin the match as underdog, but they dominated early exchanges and took a deserved lead thanks to a wonderful 30-yard drive by Mockin. That superlative strike was scant reward for Celtic's overall prominence in the opening 45 minutes, and when Hibs began the second period on the charge, it looked like the Glasgow team would regret not making the most of their earlier dominance. Time after time, Hibernian were thwarted by the inspired John Bonner. A frustratingly inconsistent performer, the Celtic keeper picked the perfect moment to produce the finest 45 minutes of his career. Brilliant save followed miracle stop as the Celts defied the much-lauded High Beast forward line to hold out for a most memorable victory. The Coronation Cup would now reside permanently at Parkhead. How that would rankle in the establishment. More than 60 years after their formation, Celtic were a club proudly open to all, but there was no doubt they remained an institution of Scotland's Irish Catholic community. That this club should win a tournament celebrating the coronation of a British monarch would have unquestionably pained some within Scottish football, perhaps nowhere more so than at the SFA, who a year previously had launched an astonishing attack on Celtic's identity. The early years of the 1950s had seen terrorist clashes between Celtic and Rangers supporters becoming increasingly common and violent. This misbehaviour reached a brutal climax at the New Year's Day derby of 1952, and the authorities decided enough was enough. As an investigation into the trouble began, the Celtic board was only too happy to support Glasgow's magistrates in introducing measures addressing the problem of hooliganism. But little did they know that one of these measures would see an emotive and integral part of a club's heritage come under attack. Following their inquiry, magistrates made several recommendations to the SFA. The most controversial was the fourth. It stated that the two clubs should avoid displaying flags which might incite feeling amongst the spectators. This was construed as a reference to Celtic's flying of the flag of error, and for some within the SFA, the recommendation was a green light to deliver another blow to the struggling Glasgow giant. The referee committee of the SFA demanded Celtic refrain from displaying in its park any flag or emblem that had no association with the country or the sport. However, with the proud roots of the club under attack, Celtic, and in particular Chairman Kelly, stood their ground with an admirable principled tenacity. When the full SFA Council convened to consider the matter, Kelly stood to defend Celtic's traditions, and he moved the rejection of that part dealing with the banning of the flag. His motion was seconded by John Wilson of Rangers, but the Council ignored Celtic's plea and warned if the club continued to fly the flag and trouble occurred, they'd be face a fine, or closure of the ground, or suspension, or all three of those penalties. As Celtic ignored the SFA's ruling, the Association's Secretary George Graham, with the support of Harry Swan of Hibs, continued to demand the flag's removal. Celtic, having taken legal advice, were not for budging. Kelly was fiercely stubborn in his resistance, and with the support for the flag ban within the SFA fragmenting, Graham was forced to give up the battle. Quietly, the matter was dropped. The Irish flag, which salutes the simple fact Celtic were founded by Irishmen, would continue to fly on high at Parkhead. After the wonderful and unexpected Coronation Cup triumph, the tricolour would soon be joined by the league flag, as the victorious spring of 1953 provided the belief and foundation for a superb league and cup double.
He said Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic overall.
Hello and welcome to Chapter 5 of the Celtic History Podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to say tonight I have the one and only Paul Brennan from Celtic Quick News. How are you this evening, Paul?
I'm very well, Chris. How are you?
Not too bad, Paul. Not too bad at all. You've actually pulled one of the plum draws out of the hat, getting 1950 to 1960. I
think so, yeah. I kind of was hoping for the 1960s, but, well, who needs it too easy? Let's do the decade before that. It's a decade that was compared to the decades we've had since then, a complete and utter desert, although not without its highlight, not without its incredible controversies, and with most, if not many, or many if not most, of the great characters in their history floating about the Celtic Football Club in the 1950s.
Well, it wouldn't be a Celtic History podcast without jubilation, depression, fantastic players, controversy, the whole 9 yards.
Absolutely.
So just to get us quickly kicked off, I'll run through all the honours that we won during the period as I do in all the chapters. So we were champions once, we were Scottish Cup winners twice, 1951, 1954. We were amazingly League Cup winners twice. We won one Glasgow Cup, 2 Glasgow Charity Cups. We won the St Mungo's Cup, and we won a thing called the Coronation Cup. Not a bad haul.
Not at all, no. It was, of course, it was the decade where we won a couple of distinct trophies. The Coronation Cup, for bizarre reasons, is celebrated enormously still by Celtic fans, and the St Mungo's Cup had quite a number of unique elements to it as well. So these things were celebrated way beyond their importance, probably by Celtic supporters. They wouldn't have been in the 60s, I think, or in the 70s, or certainly after that, but we celebrated them back then because league football at Celtic Park was just so difficult, and we lost lots and lots of games.
And we talked in some of the earlier podcasts about the poverty at the time, coming up to the First World War and after the First World War, and here we are now in 1950 to 1960. The war's over 5 years, and still Glasgow was far from a place of milk and honey.
Well, that's true. There was, at the start of the decade, you still have rationing, you still have people without a whole lot of money in their pockets in the west of Scotland, certainly. But Britain's changing. You're getting people beginning to buy televisions in the 1950s. They've got maybe slightly more leisure time, and by the end of the decade, slightly more money in their pocket. Housing is increasing. You get the city, the big city, Glasgow, begins to sprawl out into the suburbs, and you get council housing built in the suburbs, the likes of which people simply didn't have prior to that. So it was a time where people were on the move demographically, and I think that showed a wee bit in their choices of what to do with their leisure time as well, because football really was on the decline throughout the 1950s.
But still, it was the 50s where the supporters started to get more organised and away from the sort of the break club ideas, and start to organise transport, the away matches and all that kind of stuff.
That's right. And league football was originally born out of the railways, because people didn't have the ability to travel across country before the railways, and they occasionally did it for friendly or initially for cup games, but it was only at the birth of the railways that you got the opportunity for football clubs initially to travel one end of the country to the other. And after the war, you get bus transport, and there was this whole industry not only for football but for trips to the seaside that kicked off right across Britain, and one of the consequences of that was the supporters club, and I think it was 1948 that the Celtic Supporters Association started.
That's right.
But you're right, they really kicked off in the 1950s and through into the 60s.
And again, the beauty of this period, this decade, is the quality of the players that we had on the pitch. You know, Bobby Collins, Bobby Evans, you had John McPhail and Willie Fernie, Bertie Peacock, and of course the likes of Charlie Tully and Jock Stein.
I mean, my father was 8 in 1950 and 18 in 1960, so his formative years were in the 1950s. So when I grew up, I heard all of these names, and he waxed lyrical about them, and he told me how fantastic they were and how great they were and how brilliant they were. But of course, compared to the team that followed, they won practically nothing. And it is the decade where we had so many of the great characters, and not only that team, not only the team that won a Coronation Cup or one or two League Cups later, as no doubt we'll mention, but you'd Bertie All joined the club in 1955. You'd Stevie Chalmers, you'd Billy McNeil, you'd Paddy Crerand. You know, you'd the embryo of the team that subsequently came. I think Bobby Murdoch, in fact, was there in the 1950s as well. So you'd the early stages of what would become the Lisbon Lions there in the 1950s. You had the great names. Sir Robert Kelly is, of course, correctly and widely regarded as one of the most important guardians of the football club, but he was there throughout the 1950s. He became chairman in 1947, I think, and really didn't achieve a great deal. One or two outstanding performances aside, didn't achieve a great deal, didn't push the club on really until he got right into the mid-60s, and they made one spectacularly well-informed decision. So you had all of these people. You had Jimmy McGrory there as well. You had Jimmy Hogan. Now, you may or may not know Jimmy Hogan, but Jimmy Hogan is credited with being the father of the great Hungarian team in the 1950s. He's credited with being the father of the great Austrian team in the 1930s. He spent from, I think, about 1912 to the 1940s, just spreading the gospel of football throughout continental Europe, and he gave the game to the continent. He gave the game to Holland and to Austria and to Germany and to Hungary, and he ended up at Celtic Park in the 1950s. He was a man in his 70s at that stage, but he was there, and the club were trying to borrow a wee bit of his wisdom, and to maybe some or other extent they did, because he mostly dealt with the reserves, and he dealt with people like Jock Stein, and had an influence over people like Jock Stein, although perhaps not directly over what was happening in the first team or over Jimmy McGrory himself. But he was there. Jimmy Gribben, the great scout, the man who, Robert Kelly is the man who is accredited with getting Jock Stein back into the club as a player. But Jimmy Gribben was the man that says, look, what about Jock Stein, the old Albion Rovers player? He's down at Clonethley, and we can get him up. And he was absolutely instrumental to bringing the club up from its nadir at some point in the 1950s into what it ultimately became a decade or so later.
From the very first days of Celtic, the club had been proud of their Irish roots. The name of the club itself was a link to the common ancestry of both the immigrants from across the sea and their neighbours with whom they now lived. A nod to the Celts of Ireland and the Celts of Scotland, now united by the support for a charitable football club. Playing in a traditional Irish colour of green was another constant reminder, but perhaps the most notable tradition at Celtic Park was the flying of the Irish flag. Before the formation of the Irish Free State in 1922, a gold harp on a green background had flown on the north side of the stadium next to the pavilion. Following Irish independence, the tricolour of green, white and orange had replaced it. This was no ordinary flag either, having been presented to the club by none other than Eamon de Valera, the first Irish Taoiseach of the Irish Free State. For the next 30 years, the flag flew at Celtic Park until disruption during the New Year Glasgow Derby match in 1952 caused the Glasgow magistrates to recommend several actions be taken at Celtic Park. While some actions were simple enough and included 3 new passageways to be created on the East Terracing to allow easier access and exiting, it was the 4th recommendation that would cause the most concern. Directed at both Celtic and Rangers, the magistrates said that the two clubs should avoid displaying flags which might incite feeling among the spectators. The SFA took this to refer to the tricolour, and the referee committee of the SFA ruled that Celtic be asked to refrain from displaying in its park any flag or emblem that had no association with the country or the sport. When the committee's ruling came to a vote at the SFA, Celtic's Bob Kelly made an impassioned plea to reject the park concerning the flag, citing Celtic's proud tradition and heritage. When it came time to vote, it went to the wire. Rangers' John Wilson had the final say and voted in Celtic's favour. Despite that defeat, pressure from acting SFA President and Hibernian Chairman Harry Swan, as well as SFA Secretary George Graham, continued for the remainder of the season. One sniff of a problem from Celtic or its support, or the flag continued to fly over the hayshed, and they would be facing a fine, closure of the ground, or even suspension. Fortunately, no further action took place, and the furore over the flag eventually died away to nothing, and indeed the Irish tricolour still proudly flies over Celtic Park today. With the demise of Belfast Celtic across the water still a recent memory, Bob Kelly's firm stance was a brave one, but ultimately proved to be the right one. Indeed, at the end of that 1951-52 season, Celtic travelled across to Ireland to play a friendly against Belfast Celtic, and sadly one of the final games for the, by then, leagueless Belfast club. 1957 saw the first real development at Celtic Park in almost 30 years, when the club installed a roof over the west terracing of the stadium for the first time. Although it was a welcome relief from the Scottish weather, the roof only covered the back of the terracing. Because of this, it was not an uncommon sight on rainy days to see the front of the west terracing completely empty, as the Celtic fans all chose to huddle at the back from the elements. This would not be the last time Celtic supporters would be spotted huddling. By the end of the 1950s, Celtic Park was also starting to become accustomed to night matches under the new £40,000 trench light floodlights. The towering columns at the corners of the stadium were first used in a friendly against Wolverhampton Wanderers in October 1959. Unfortunately for Celtic, it was the visitors who would win the match 2-0, but the coming years would see visitors from across Europe visit Celtic Park for midweek night matches under the floodlights, and losing to them was not something that would happen all too often.
But it's funny you should mention Hogan and Gribben, because they were really behind the scenes looking at what was coming next, and it's only really when we moved into the 60s that we saw all this coming to fruition. But we're going to talk about later on in the podcast the difference in the styles between this Jimmy McRory figure that everybody loved and played for the club and a hero at the club, and then you had Jock Stein coming in, who was more of a disciplinarian, and a contrast in styles. So we'll have a wee chat about that later on. But the first thing we should kick off with is 1951. We had Celtic 1, Motherwell 0 in the Scottish Cup final, and this was the first trophy that Celtic had lifted since 1938, and the first time we'd lifted the Scottish Cup since 1937. So all through the year was talked about in the last chapter. This was things starting to maybe it's a wrong term to use, false dawn, but because we had a few false dawns, but the old Celtic was starting to come back.
Yeah, I think you're dead right. Was it a false dawn? Well, it wasn't really a false dawn because it was followed by quite a few trophies in the first half of the 1950s and ultimately in the double in 1954. But of course, it died again. You know, the legs were taken away from whatever embryonic rebirth was underway, but it put Celtic back on the map as a football team. And I know you've covered in the earlier decades where we were, but Celtic in 1950 were significantly less important in Scottish football than Hibs. You know, Hibs at 1950 were the top team in Scotland, the famous five. They won 3 championships and narrowly missed out on another 2 between the late 40s and the early 50s. And it's something that's never really properly appreciated. They were attracting bigger crowds in Celtic round about then as well. The job that we'd done to them in the 1880s and 1890s and somewhat stealing their clothes had been reversed, and this fantastic Hibs team had come and usurped Celtic to some or other extent. So the Celtic fans in 1950 really must have been wondering what was going on with their football club and where it was all going. They were still there in huge numbers for the big games and for the cup games and for games against Rangers, but it was becoming very difficult to be a Celtic supporter, I've no doubt. And then in 1951, they won the Scottish Cup, which would have been a huge occasion in Scottish life. There was over 130,000 people at Hampden Park, and you know, I live about a 20-minute drive away from Hampden Park. Nobody lived 20 minutes away from Hampden Park or a 20-minute journey away from Hampden Park in 1951. People came from right across Scotland to that and would have invested a huge amount of their money, their free time, and their being into actually attending that game and being at that game. It was against a Motherwell team that were no mean feat. You know, Motherwell were a decent outfit back in the 30s, 40s and in the 50s, and it was a big result for Celtic, and it did lead on to other things.
And even you say people come to travel to Hampden Park and from all around Scotland, but when you also threw into the mix that Belfast Celtic had just folded in 1949, and you're then starting to see more supporters coming over from Ireland on what they called the old cattle boats in the 50s. And it was a cattle boat. You come over the ferry and the Celtic fans were put below deck where they actually kept the cattle.
I know all about it, Chris. My father, when he was a kid, went the other way for their summer holidays and stayed with their relatives over in Ireland, and they got, it was somewhere in the city centre, in fact, that the boat came off. I think it was maybe round about the Broomielaw that the boat actually docked. So they went their summer holidays, going back, and I know exactly what you meant, and it was the way people travelled. It was literally, you got on the same boat as the cattle, and travelled back and forth to Ireland, and it was the opportunity for the second generation people who lived in Scotland and born in Scotland to go back, in inverted commas, home and see the family back in Ireland, and an opportunity for the Irish to come across and watch Celtic.
I think there's us poor boys coming over from Belfast with the HSS takes an extra hour or is late or something like that, and or even heaven forbid, if they get the slow boat.
I know. Listen, we get well used to it, and I go off my head if I'm in a traffic jam in London Road. Yeah, I really do.
Look, Paul, don't even start me about that. It takes us an hour to get from the car park at Celtic Park down onto the motorway to travel down to England. I'm not even going to go.
Chris, I could talk to you for an hour about this. Why don't they put traffic policemen on? I mean, it's as simple and straightforward. There is a huge line of traffic. Why not put the lights out and put a traffic policeman on? Anyway.
See, Paul, that's why we got you on here that night, because you're a genius coming up with that idea.
Aye. I bet you was the first one too.
So we win the Cup in 1951, and then probably one of the most significant events in 1951 as well was the signing of a man called Jock Stein to the playing staff.
Aye, well, Jock Stein was a Lanarkshire man. He lived just a few miles away from where I live and where I grew up, and he lived in a town which had two ends to it, a Celtic end and a Rangers end, as I'm sure everybody knew, and Jock Stein was a Rangers man and was a big Rangers fan, a big supporter of Geordie Young, the Rangers player, Rangers captain at the time. He played for Albion Rovers, and he went down to Llanelli Town, who were a non-league club in Wales. He was a minor part-time footballer in Scotland, but Llanelli Town took him down and paid him I think £12 a week, which at that stage was a pretty decent wage. But Celtic needed a central defender, and Jimmy Gribben, the scout, says, look, what about Jock Stein? And Stein, of course, didn't miss a beat in getting back up the road. His wife had been burgled in Burnbank, and there was a wee bit of strain on home living and home life, and he wasn't really enjoying life in Wales, so he came back up to Celtic and without any hesitation. But it caused him quite interesting problems. He said to his biographer Archie Macpherson, who wrote a fantastic book on him, that some of his friends simply never spoke to him again, and his own parents, his mother and father, had trouble with him as a Celtic player. His father never wished him well before a Celtic game, never asked him how he got on, and so he came from this big Rangers family, big Rangers tradition, and joined Celtic, and from that moment on just completely and utterly immersed himself in our football club. He went from being a supporter of Rangers in the early 1950s, which was as, let's use the word, staunch as it could possibly be in that club's history, to being an absolutely devoted Celtic supporter and Celtic follower, and to the point that I think the intensity of the feelings that he had for his new club and for the club that he formerly supported that kicked off really in 1951 never left him, and was something that he fed into players. And that, I've spoken to Celtic players who played under him and who came from a Rangers tradition, and I know that the will to win, the will to get one over for the people out there, which in this instance is you and me and our forefathers, was something that he never missed an opportunity to ram home, and he was able to communicate that with real sincerity and feeling, and I think you underestimate that at your peril, and what subsequently happened when he became in charge of the football club. But he was a decent central defender. He wasn't a great player. He never did enormous things apart from a few seasons at Celtic. He became club captain. Sean Fallon was the captain and broke his arm. And Sean Fallon, again, for people, you speak to people who watched Celtic in the 50s, he was known as the Iron Man. Now, footballers back in the 1950s were all Iron Men, so I hate to think what somebody that's actually singled out and called Iron Man played the game like, but apparently he was as hard as nails, and when he broke his arm and couldn't play, Jock Stein took over and deputised and retained the position. We pushed on. Now, what happened? Well, we had maybe a wee bit of the influence of Jimmy Hogan. We had certainly the influence of Jimmy Gribben. We had Jimmy McGrory there as manager. I'm not convinced that he was a significant player as manager. I think that it's well documented that the board, to some or other extent, picked the team and hugely influenced things. I know I've spoken to players who were kicking about at that point in time. And they weren't always terribly generous towards the manager either. There wasn't the deference that maybe Stein got or maybe other people got. Jimmy McGrory was known as too much of a gentleman, and I think that some players maybe at that time played on that a wee bit. So there was maybe a lack of discipline, but all of a sudden you get the likes of Stein who's got a notion as to how things should be and grabs a hold of the dressing room, and Celtic grew and Celtic started to win things as a consequence of that.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
Favourite of a player?
My favourite of our players, possibly, probably Packy Bonner. Playing football in my days, always midfield or striker, and that was just funny. I went for Big Packy, but I don't know, for some reason, I think it's maybe because you're young now, it was Irish or that kind of side of the club. I just loved Big Packy Bonner. Obviously at times he was exceptional, at times he was maybe not so good, but Big Packy, just loved the big guy. I thought he was brilliant, and obviously the Irish link, stuff like that. Even back then, it was kind of, most of the team was Scottish and Irish, so even being Farm was a bit exotic back then.
Declare to Singapore or China, America or Canada, you'll find them.
First game was with my uncle. It was a friendly against Manchester United at home. I don't know if it was, it would have been maybe 4, maybe 5 I pushed. It would have been maybe Brian McClare's testimonial, I can't totally remember. And I think after that you get kind of hooked when you go and see the big stadium at that age. And after that I went with my uncle really regularly. My dad worked away, so I went with him. And I loved it.
Favourite game as a Celtic fan? Home or away, or legal or illegal? What do you want to go for?
Barcelona at home. It's an obvious choice, but just the whole kind of history of the game, I think, you know what I mean? There was a service at St Mary's the night before, and we as boys in the group were obviously setting up for days, and we'd planned for a long time, and I was a nervous wreck beforehand, and I think just the way everything came together that night was special, and I think that'll live long in a memory for everyone that was there.
Celtic, the greatest team we've ever seen. The Lisbon Lions with Big Jock Stein.
Favourite ever moment as a Celtic supporter, or what do you think about when you wake up in the morning? Celtic, what does Celtic mean to you?
Oh, favourite ever moment would be Boa Vista final whistle. Just meant we were going to a European final and never thought we would see. I was there, yeah.
Okay.
County Clare to Singapore or China.
Favourite Celtic player?
Probably Lubo Moravcik, just different class. Head and shoulders above everybody else, had it in the brain, had it in the feet. Outstanding player. Best game I've never been at was Love Street when we won the league in the 86. That was the best game I wasn't at.
Yeah, that's a good call.
And best game I was at, the night we won the league at Tannadice after Tommy Burns passed away. That was emotional. That was just something I think will live with everybody. It was a fantastic game.
And if I was to ask you what Celtic meant to you, if you woke up in the morning and somebody says, "What's Celtic?" what would you say?
A way of life. Way of life.
Followers of Celtic.
There's an awful lot sort of made about Jock Stein's footballing ability, and through reading a lot of history books and a lot of the research that I've done and reading the press at the time, was his playing style a wee bit belittled? Because he was captain of the team, and he, as I say, he joined in 1851, and then he goes on to captain the team that wins the Coronation Cup against this brilliant Hibs team.
Yeah. I think you probably make a good point there, because there's another wee interesting aspect to this whole thing. He's at Albion Rovers now. It's hard for us to really imagine Albion Rovers players going anywhere in the game right now unless they're teenagers in their first couple of seasons before they've been discovered. But he spent most of his playing career at Albion Rovers. When Llanelli took him to pay them as much money as the Rangers captain George Young was on at that point in time. So he went to Llanelli as a part of a big play by Llanelli to get into league football. Now, Llanelli fell apart shortly thereafter. Recent times weren't the first time that football clubs disappeared, and Llanelli simply couldn't afford the gamble that they'd undertaken with Stein and one or two others. So you could be right. This player who was playing part-time football with Rovers and playing part-time football with Llanelli and then pitches up at Celtic, there might have been more to him than many of us actually give him credit for.
And when you go on, you talk about the Coronation Cup final in 1853. Although this goes down in folklore with Celtic fans, when you look at the final and you consider the Hibernian team at the time, there was no doubt that during the game, Celtic's goalkeeper Johnny Bonner kept them in the match.
Yeah. Look, this was the great Hibs team, and it's pointless even saying the words the great Hibs team, because Hibs only had one great team. This is it. They were by far the best team in Scotland. They had their famous five, as I say. They won 3 titles. They narrowly missed out in 2, one of which was in goal average. They were probably the best team in Britain at that point in time, at a time when British football was probably the best in Europe. So Hibs could have done things in European competition. Had European competition been established, that team never actually got the chance to. Of course, they were the first Scottish team to enter Europe in 1955, but they were given that entry on the back of their reputation, which at that stage was several years old and slightly ill-deserved, because the team was on the wane quite considerably by 1955, albeit they reached the semi-final of the European Cup in its inaugural season. But I really think that you're looking at that Hibs team as potentially the best team in Europe at that stage. Celtic went up against them as huge underdogs. Johnny Bonner, by all match reports, played the game of his life, and Celtic won the game 2-0, and it was huge. Now, people of my generation first knew about this and wondered why the hell Celtic were celebrating the Coronation Cup of all things. It was a friendly trophy. It was about the coronation. I'm having trouble really relating to it or figuring out what it was all about. But it was an opportunity for the Scottish clubs to take on the English clubs, and you don't need to be Scottish to understand how important it is when we get an opportunity to do that. You always feel as though you get something to prove against the English, and the Scottish clubs certainly did it on that tournament. You also have the opportunity of taking on a right sexy football team in the final in Hibernian, and they did it, and it could well have been a bit like we took on Barcelona in the Champions League this season. We're pinned into our own box, the goalkeeper plays the game of his life, and we end up winning the game and going home with a trophy.
And the irony is, it was Celtic against Hibernian in the Coronation Cup final. Where else would you find two teams further removed from the Coronation than Celtic and Hibernian?
Well, absolutely, and I don't know who it would have been. Maybe Rangers and Linfield had they tried to enter it, but it was absolutely bizarre, and it was a strange thing for us to celebrate, I think. But it just shows you how how desperate and starved for success Celtic supporters were that we're still talking about it, and you know, we still live on the back of it to some other extent today.
And a little anecdote on the background of the Coronation Cup was that the players actually nearly went on strike because the club deemed that this was like an off-season type of venture, and tried to reduce their wages from £20 a week to like £8 or £10 a week, and they nearly went on strike.
It's quite right too, because this is what happened in football. Football didn't reward anyone in the 50s and didn't reward anyone in the 60s either, and it was like that. Out of season you were paid a subsistence pay, and you know, you simply got on with it, and a lot of guys had to go out and get a summer job to make ends meet.
So we've kind of jumped ahead of ourselves with the Coronation Cup, because in the previous year, in 1852, there was bad trouble on the terracing at the New Year's Day game between Celtic and Rangers, and this actually resulted in a standoff in Scottish football when the SFA instructed Celtic to take the Irish flag down. And Robert Kelly, for all his faults, or for all his praise, depends what side of the fence you sit on, made a stand and decided that Celtic would not take the flag down, and they'd rather go out of football a la Belfast Celtic as opposed to adhere to the wishes of the SFA.
Well, this is one of the defining moments in Celtic's history, and until that point it is probably the defining moment in Celtic's history after the 1890s, when there's probably one or two defining moments in the early years itself. But the club pretty much kicked along from the late 1890s up until 1952. They played Rangers on New Year's Day. There was crowd trouble. There'd been crowd trouble in football for 40 years at that stage. It was nothing new, but it was obviously getting worse, and it was obviously getting out of hand, and there were people being injured, and it was the crowds were enormous, and it was impossible to police, and there was genuine danger at football. Now, all of these things are true, and it didn't go away in the 1950s. They went away briefly in the 1990s, but I don't think that the game is completely rid itself of crowd trouble. And you look, it's always young people that are blamed for these things. But God help us, you know, young people have been doing these things for 90 years. If it's the case, it's young people, and it's a generational thing in football. Anyhow, it comes to Celtic Park in 1952. There's bottles flying all over the place. There's general mayhem inside the stadium, and the referees committee of the SFA decide in their wisdom that something needs to be done about it, and that they go to an SFA council meeting, and the referees committee propose that foreign flags are prohibited from Scottish football grounds, that the Celtic flying the Irish tricolour was a provocative act in itself, and led to some of the riotous behaviour at the New Year's Day game against Rangers. So at this point we could just react to that, but you remember the old English lessons when you're given a wee introduction to a scenario, and then you're told to go away and write 500 words to interpret what you've just written here, or what you've just read here. A referees committee and then the SFA council voted to say that the Irish flag provoked a riot at a football game, and as a result of that, the flag needs to go. It tells you everything you need to know about where we've been as a country, never mind as a football country, a football club, and then a bit about the SFA. Now, it was very easy for us to overplay this one. The SFA redeemed themselves ultimately, and I wouldn't want to overplay it without touching on where things ultimately got to. But it brings Celtic right back to, well, what's it all about? What's the club all about? Where does the club stand on issues of principle? And the one thing I couldn't find about this whole story is where the tricolour itself came from. There's a degree of permanency about the tricolour at Celtic Park, but clearly it didn't always exist at Celtic Park. It was not the flag of Ireland before Ireland existed as an independent country. It was used in the Easter Uprising. It became the flag of the Free State, which was established some 30 years before this riot. Did Celtic pick it up at that point? Well, they might have, but I can't find a reference for it, and I suspect that they might not have picked it up at that point when the Free State ultimately became the Republic of Ireland just a few years prior to the riot. It was maybe another occasion when the flag may have been picked up, or it may have been about for several years. No matter when the club picked it up, it was there, and it was deemed both appropriate and important to the club to have the flag there. But you then look at what's going on in Scottish society at the time. Ireland had left the Union, they'd left the Empire, and they had remained neutral, officially neutral, although technically not absolutely neutral, but officially neutral during the war. And they were viewed by some in Britain, and certainly some in Scotland, as a hostile foreign country. And that's a statement of fact. Is how they were viewed in some places. And so this flag of a foreign land, which was viewed by the people who ultimately voted against it, was viewed as representing a hostile foreign land, and therefore seen somehow as legitimising protest against it, or undermining those who tried to prevent riots against it. And so all of these things fed into people, not necessarily from a Rangers perspective, and it's very easy for us to inappropriately blame Rangers for this, because it wasn't them. This was 26 clubs in the SFA voted to prohibit this flag, and 7 clubs, including Celtic, voted against prohibiting this flag. So it was a widespread feeling among the Scottish football clubs, and no doubt among Scotland itself. It tells you a wee bit about how Ireland's viewed in Scotland, a wee bit about how the Irish are viewed in Scotland, a wee bit about how the Irish diaspora are viewed in Scotland. And it certainly pins Celtic as this kind of foreign club to some other extent in Scotland. Now, what does Celtic do about it? Well, Celtic say, well, OK, we are where we are. We're a club with an Irish history. We're a club who play in Scotland. They dominated the game in Scotland up till the mid-1920s, but by this stage we're a quarter of a century into some pretty dark days, and we no longer dominate, and we're no longer really a significant economic power in the game either. The game exists largely without Celtic. And we've seen Belfast Celtic collapse under duress just a few years earlier. So it's a potential endgame. You could see the football club simply saying, right, enough is enough, just as Belfast Celtic had just a few years earlier. Sir Robert Kelly, a well-connected, educated and politically aware operator, said, no, we fly the flag. It doesn't come down, and we'll take any consequences that may be coming our way as a result of this. Now, the SFA ultimately propose a special general meeting, which is held, and the debate is held again on this, and Celtic are they're off the hook for all intents and purposes. The vote goes the other way. It wasn't overwhelmingly the other way, but it was the majority of the vote went the other way. I've got it written down here actually. It was 18 votes to 12 in favour of Celtic. At the second meeting, Robert Kelly doesn't open his mouth, but he's like all these wise Celtic leaders at these occasions. He's got the votes in the bag before he goes into the meeting. It was Dundee United who led the campaign, followed by Clyde and Queen's Park, and then by Rangers, and Rangers seconded the amendment. that the first proposal should be struck down. And the argument basically at the first meeting was objected to not on the grounds of sporting fairness or racial harmony or any of these other things. It was argued against because it was against the Articles of Association of the SFA. It was illegal under the SFA Articles of Association. So those were the terms under which the reprieve was granted. Not that, look, don't be ridiculous, this is just not how to conduct your business. The reprieve was granted because those people who argued against it argued that you could not enforce this rule and that you were acting against your own corporate laws, and therefore the motion should be struck down, and it was struck down. And as I say, Rangers Football Club were one of the prominent speakers against it, and Celtic went on. None of these debates touched on any of the other things that were going on, the other sectarian elements that were going on in Scottish football, which didn't seem worthy of comment or recognition or admonishment even. They were simply accepted as, well, fair enough, this is how we are, this is how we operate, these are the traditions of football clubs, and we got on with it. So it was a seminal moment in our history, and it could have been Glasgow Celtic, could have been Belfast Celtic, full stop, in 1952. So Robert Kelly was very politically aware, very wise and respected man in the game. The chap who was in the vanguard of suppressing Celtic at the time was the SFA secretary. The secretary was the position which ultimately became the chief executive. Ernie Walker, as recently as Ernie Walker was secretary as opposed to chief executive. So he's a man in day-to-day charge of running the SFA, and the chap, whose name escapes me at the moment, Sir George Graham, Knight of the Realm. Her Majesty must have been full of it when she knighted him. He was the guy who attempted to have the thing forced through, have the flag, the Irish tricolour, banned from all football grounds, and he had the city, Glasgow City, on his side. He had the SFA on his side, the majority of the clubs on his side initially. Anyway, Kelly worked it well in the background, and ultimately became president of the SFA. So it was not as though the SFA was a bitter anti-Irish, anti-Celtic organisation. It came into 1952 voting that way. It let Celtic off the hook on a technicality, not because it was a ridiculous rule to impose as it was, but ultimately it also made Sir Robert Kelly the man who overcame this hurdle, its president. So, as early as the 1950s, Celtic are sitting at the top table of the SFA and respected by the majority of the clubs to get into that position in the first place.
I'm absolutely delighted to have on the line the one and only Charlie Gallagher. How are you doing, Charlie?
Not too bad, Chris, not too bad at all. 1956, that's when I started at Celtic training. After that, 18 years of age, I signed as a professional in I get mixed up. When I was 1958. That's right. And I played my first game 1959. I had a good game, never got another game for 2 years. That was the way Celtic, you have heard these stories often, that they were very bad at picking teams, and the team never get picked till maybe 5 minutes before the start of the game, and nobody knew who was playing or who wasn't playing. But that was the way it was in those days. It was very erratic. The manager poor Jimmy McGraw, he was a nice guy, but he wasn't a manager, he was only a mouthpiece there for the chairman. So that was my early days at Celtic Park.
So whenever you made your debut, that was against Wraith Rovers, as you say, in August 59.
August 59, yeah.
Did you think, that's it, I've made it?
Oh, I thought because one of the newspaper reporters of those days, he worked in the Glasgow Herald, a friend of Bob Kelly's, who was the chairman at the time, and then the following Monday morning I got a fantastic write-up, and he says, that's another inside man for Celtic. I never got a game for another 15 months. that would be the chairman's way of saying, right, you've done well, but you've got to do better. That was my taking of the situation, but that's the way it was at Celtic. You never knew you could be. I remember one day Johnny Divers was playing in a team, and I knew I wasn't playing the day, and I turned up, and Johnny Divers had been playing for Scotland in an international game against Ireland, and in those days you brought your own boots with you. Mm-hmm. Johnny Divers forgot to bring the boots up to Celtic Park, and he had no boots to play with. There was only one pair of boots, so he was dropped, and I was picked. I was sitting having a pie or something before the start of the game, and I was told I was playing.
Hot boots well played.
So that's the way you get into teams in those days. Somebody forgets their boots.
Alright, so it's May the 12th, and I'm absolutely delighted to say that on the line I have the one and only John Fallon. Good afternoon, John, how are you?
Good evening, here. There were 3 goalkeepers there, and we were all part-time, and all trained on a Tuesday and a Thursday night. Dick Beattie, Big Frank and myself. He was trained every Tuesday and Thursday night. In those days you played a trial match, and it was around about the 8th of December, and it was at Motherwell. It was a very icy day, and it was solid ground, and Charlie Tully was actually playing in that game.
Right. Was this the first team or the second team?
It's the second team, and Charlie was recovering from an injury, and he had a column in the newspapers at night, and he turned around and he was very friendly with Bob Kelly as usual, and in the paper he says, one for the future, and he mentioned my name. So the following week, the Tuesday, was called into Celtic Park after training, and asked me to sign then, and that was that. Because the first team I played with was Fallon Curran, that's right, and it was Fallon, Curran and Malkin. And then a half-back line would be Clare and McNeil, but the first team at that time was Eric Smith, Bobby Evans, Bertie Peacock, Neely Malkin at left back, Duncan Mackay at right back. You played with these guys, and except Dunky, the other 4, you were standing watching them in the terraces, and then all of a sudden you were playing with them, Charlie Tully as well, and you were saying... That's
really a who's who of Celtic you just called out there, wasn't it?
That's what I'm saying.
You know, that era?
They played with Wally Fernie when he came back as well.
Uh-huh.
But you just didn't... All of these guys, and Bobby Collins had just left. I knew Bobby as well, and trained with Bobby as well. And you think of some of the great players that I've played with. It's unbelievable.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Tell me, I'll have to ask this before we go any further. Did Big Frank get much slagging about the 9-3 match against England?
He didn't care.
Did he not know?
He didn't give a toots. And that was just that, walked away. He just walked away and left it like that, as if it nothing happened.
The difference between the likes of Frank Hoffey and Ronnie Simpson, could 2 characters be any more different?
No, never. They were extrovert, you know, and they always showed out to the crowd and dance, you know, conducting the choirs, and happy-go-lucky big man. That was one thing about him, you know. I wish they had that about him, you know. He didn't care if he made a mistake, that's too bad.
Come full circle now, because when we looked at the establishment of the club, we saw the Irishness come out and see it sort of get diluted into a more sort of labour type of attitude. But here we were in 1952, and all of those old skeletons came back out of the closet. And the very fact that Eamon de Valera presented the club with this flag brought the whole Irishness back. And as you say, Paul, the Republic of Ireland had just been formed in 1949. And here we were, a club that was in the doldrums, and then at the start of the 50s, maybe starting to put its head up again and starting to get a bit of its pride back again. And although this wasn't really a starting point, but it was a bit of a stand that Celtic made at the time to say that they were here, and they're here for the long haul, and they weren't going to back down in the face of any adversity.
No, and watching the history of the club and seeing Scottish society change, and I've seen, in my time, I'm 46, I've seen the demographics of the Celtic support change quite significantly, even in my time. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a healthy thing. I think it's good that Celtic continued to attract more and more people beyond the base that gave its birth back in the 1880s. But inevitably, that's going to bring people into the club that don't care about Ireland, that don't care about that history, that find it interesting and maybe fun and enjoyable, but don't feel it. You know, they're Scottish, or they're Italian, or they're Greek. And you get Celtic supporters from all of those communities who feel about their traditional ethnic lands in an appropriate way, and Ireland doesn't come into that feeling. You know, they're Celtic supporters for lots of other reasons, because the club is open and has welcomed them. So inevitably, you're going to get that drift, if you like, from where we were when the club was born. But 1952 it comes into sharp focus again now. Where does the club go? The club can either regress back into its roots, or it can maintain its open stance and continue to move forward in an open way. And it does exactly that. It's re-established its Irishness, it's re-established its heritage, but it continues to push ahead. And of course, Jock Stein, the Rangers supporting man, comes in, becomes captain, and blows the whole thing out the water. And we went on then to 1953, 1954, when we won our first double since 1914. Yeah. An enormous year for the club, and really, is it the false dawn? Well, on this occasion, it absolutely is the false dawn. It was fantastic for Celtic to win a cup. It was fantastic for them to win the Scottish Cup. It was great for them to win their one and only league in the decade, but really, that was it. You saw us win the Scottish Cup, win the St Mungo in 51, the Scottish in 51, the Coronation in 53, follow that up with the Scottish Cup and the League in 54. As a Celtic fan, you think we're back. It's back to the heyday days of Delaney and Quinn and whoever else not. But that's it. There are no more Scottish Cups, and there are no more league championships until the mid 1960s, and it drops off a cliff with one or two notable exceptions. And still, the team that played the final that day against Aberdeen, let me just read it out to you, because anybody listening will automatically recognise the large majority of this side. You know, you had John Bonner in goals, Meg Hockney, Frank Meakin, Bobby Evans, Jock Stein, Bertie Peacock, John Higgins, Willie Fernie, Sean Fallon, Charlie Tully and Neil Mochan. I mean, they're all now household names to any Celtic supporter. They are, so why didn't we win more things? You know, this is it. Why didn't the ball simply just arrive on the field and go into the opposition net time after time, because these were some of the biggest legends in their history. You know the old Tommy Cooper joke, I have a Picasso and a Stradivarius. Unfortunately, Picasso makes lousy violins and Stradivarius can't paint. To some or other extent, I think that Celtic in the 1950s, you've got McGrory there, but he's not putting the ball in the back of the net, he's sitting in the dugout. You've got Stein there, but he's not sitting in the dugout, he's sitting at centre half, and the whole thing just doesn't gel. We've not got it together. There are, bluntly, far more professional football clubs in Scotland, which make sure that Celtic don't win nearly as much as they should, nearly as much as these players should. And remember as well, football football continues to mature, it continues to develop, and it's going places throughout the 1950s and 1940s that it didn't go at Celtic Park. It's going places in Europe, it's going places in England, it's going places at Easter Road that Celtic just didn't get, and we're still trapped in pre-war technical football that was simply not successful.
In 1953, the Coronation Cup was won. Then Celtic 7, Rangers 1. 'Twas Hampden in the sun. When Bertie Peacock held aloft the cup, I heard him call. He said Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic overall.
In season 1953-54, Celtic had recovered from a poor start in the league to overhaul Heart in the title chase and take the championship by 5 points. In the Cup, they would defeat a fine Aberdeen side in a final, watched by a crowd just short of 130,000. Celtic's remarkable resurgence was in no small part linked to the arrival at Parkhead of a former Lanarkshire coal miner, Jock Stein. A competent and effective centre-half, Stein had arrived at Celtic in December 1951 from Welsh side Llanelli. Little was expected of the former Albion Rovers man, but injuries and a string of dire defensive displays from Celtic enabled Stein to stake his claim for a first-team place. He made an immediate impression. With the big man at the heart of the defence, the once lightweight boys were suddenly a noticeably more resilient outfit. Stein's commanding presence and organisational skills quickly made him a vital influence on the pitch. There was no argument when Stein was soon handed the honour of captaining the Hoops. Following the double winning campaign of season 53-54, Stein's on-field influence would gradually decline as injury took its toll on his career. Celtic would lose in 3 successive Scottish Cup finals, but in 1956 the club claimed its first ever League Cup with a 3-0 final replay victory over Partick Thistle. Across the city, Rangers' grip on Scottish football was no longer vice-like, but in 1956 the Ibrox team claimed yet another championship, and they remained much more consistent performers than the Hoops. In clashes with their rivals, Celtic would frequently enjoy the majority of play, but would eventually be ground down by the more robust Rangers. But on occasion, the Celts would tease their support with a scintillating victory and a performance which would have the fans asking why they couldn't produce such results week in and week out. One such occasion came at Ibrox on September the 21st, 1957, when the boys defeated the Scottish champions 3-2. It was Celtic's first league victory over Rangers since September 1954, and their first at Ibrox since before the war. It was against this backdrop then that on October 19th, 1957, the two teams would walk on to a sun-blessed Hampden pitch to compete in the final of the League Cup. Despite that recent win at Ibrox, few gave the boys any hope of retaining the trophy. But Celtic were about to prove the doubters wrong in the most emphatic of fashions. Right from the first whistle, the Celts charged forward. In the opening exchanges, they hit the woodwork twice, but the minutes ticked past, and with 20 minutes gone, the breakthrough had yet to come. However, unlike past encounters, the Hoops were not to be frustrated this time. In 23 minutes, Sammy Wilson fired home a first-time shot after good work by Charlie Tully. With their noses in front, the boys stepped up the pressure against an increasingly desperate Rangers defence. With half-time just a minute away, Neil Mockin charged down the left flank. After racing past Rangers fullback Shearer, Mockin hammered a thunderous shot which rocketed into the Rangers net. Half-time offered a brief respite for the Ibrox team, but from the restart they were immediately pummeled by the relentless Celts. On 53 minutes, a delightful cross and Bobby Collins was glanced into the net by the head of Billy McPhail. The slopes of Hampden were now shaken with the noisy delirium of a Celtic support. A Simpson header on 58 minutes pulled a goal back for Rangers, but if anything, this appeared to only encourage Celtic to really turn on the style. Rangers tried desperately to reorganise and switch players in the hope of stemming the tide. It was a tactic which failed miserably, as Willie Fernie, Mockin and Wilson were rampant. Goal number 4 came on 68 minutes when McPhail followed up his own parried volley to slot home from close range. Sensing a massacre, the Celtic support were not now about to settle for a mere 4 goals. For 75 minutes on the clock, Mockin netted his second after a cross on Wilson, and just 5 minutes later, McPhail showed delightful skill as he flicked the long through ball over Rangers defender Valentine before coolly slipping the ball past the sorry figure of keeper Niven for his hat-trick. While the joy of 6 had the Celtic fans in the throes of ecstasy, the Ger support were finding matters a little less fulfilling. Violence erupted among those Rangers fans still in the ground, and they began to fight amongst themselves. The trouble briefly spilled onto the pitch, but the police moved quickly to push the would-be rioters back. There was, however, nothing that could be done from stopping Celtic winning riot on the pitch. In the final minute, McPhail was brought down in the box. Willie Fernie took the kick and made it 7. 7-1. It was a most astonishing annihilation. A brief but beautiful chapter in Celtic history had just been written. Rather than signal a Celtic rebirth, the final would prove to be the last hurrah for the talents of the 1950s. But what a leaving present they left. Rangers humbled and humiliated in front of 80,000 supporters in a National Cup final. After such a victory, it is almost impossible to believe that Celtic would not win another major honour for the remainder of the decade and beyond. Yet that is exactly what happened. Talents like Collins and Fernie would be sold to clubs south of the border. As other experienced players moved on or hung up their boots, Chairman Kelly tried and failed to adequately replace acclaimed internationals with homegrown youth. It was a naive and reckless policy that saw Celtic drift towards mediocrity once more. There was nothing wrong with encouraging young talent, but at a club devoid of organisation and leadership on and off a pitch, it was a damaging folly. A folly that meant the 1950s would drift to a disappointing end. The progress of the decade's middle years seemingly wasted, the Celtic support were left again wondering what might have been. They were also left with memories of some fine players, perhaps the finest of whom was the great Charlie Tully. Blessed with a rare abundance of skill, the outrageous Tully was a darling of the Hoops fans for over a decade, but he also had a fine supporting cast. Men like Willie Fernie, Bobby Evans, Neil Mockin, Bobby Collins, Bertie Peacock, John McPhail, Sean Fallon, and many others. If the 1950s taught Celtic fans anything, it was that the club needed a leader capable of moulding the undoubted individual talent present at Parkhead into a team worthy of the hooped shirt. As 1960 ticked ever closer, the crucial question would be just how long it would take for Robert Kelly to learn the same lesson.
So Paul, it would probably be wrong for us not to discuss the word professionalism when it comes to this team, because in our romantic ways we still hark back to the days of Charlie Tully and these great entertainers, but while it was fantastic and we romanticise about it, I don't think the professionalism was there for a team to go on and win trophy after trophy after trophy. Great to Saturday and entertain, that was a team that could do that, but there just didn't seem to be that something special, the discipline to make a good team a brilliant team.
Yeah. Well, that's it. And again, I've spoken to lots of people about what Jock Stein did to the club when he took over, and you can't believe the unprofessionalism that was going about at Celtic, the lack of resources that was going about at Celtic. You talk to people about the training resources that Celtic had under Jimmy McGrory, and it was running around the track. They had a medicine ball and they ran around the track, and that was pretty much that. Footballs were scarce. Footballs were expensive. The club didn't have didn't give the money to buy football. Training kit was expensive, so they didn't train much. They had a medicine ball. They had a gym with a medicine ball in it. They ran in the gym when it was too inclement to do it outside, and they ran outside in the track when they could. This was where our football team was at as recently as the 1950s. And players chatting back to the managers, you players shrugging their shoulders when told to do things by the manager, and this led to anarchy on the football field. It led to people enjoying their football but not necessarily taking it terribly seriously, and as a consequence of all of that, Celtic just disappeared to some other extent as a credible force, given they had 3 or 4 successful seasons, and it just disappeared again, didn't exist for the second half of the decade, with one enormous exception.
I have no idea what you're talking about. So they went from smoking fags in the jungle to coming out in 1957 and creating the record score in any cup final to this day. And the score was, of course,
7-1.
Hampden and the Sun.
Yeah. And again, look at the videos of Lisbon, and you'll see Celtic fans with banners at the game that say simply 7-1. It means that much. They've got to a European Cup final, the first British team to get to a European Cup final. What do they want to say in their banners? They want to say 7-1. It was a seminal moment in our footballing history. We took on and beat our biggest rivals at a time when we couldn't do anything right on the football field, and we recorded, which was the biggest final victory in British cup final history throughout the 20th century. Nobody won a cup final with a higher score than 7-1 throughout the entire 20th century, or since then as it happened. So nobody really knows where it came from. I've got an 8-year-old son, and he only knows the name of one Rangers player, and it's Georgie Niven. And he knows Georgie Niven because it crops up in the songs, and this guy, this poor fella, is part of our heritage now. He's romanticised the songs because he let 7 goals in, and it shows you some of the professionalism of what happened at Rangers at that stage, that their centre half never kicked a ball for the club again. That was it. That kind of failure just absolutely wasn't tolerated. They had to move on from that, and they kicked John Valentine out the team, never played again for Rangers Football Club after that. But we won it. The BBC did their best to make sure that we didn't find out that we won it, because when they got back to the studio, the story was given that someone failed to take the lens cap off the camera, so BBC cameras didn't actually capture the game. There is a cine film of the game, a newsreel basically of the game, which if you ever see the goals is what you've seen, but that was it, and it was a fantastic and seminal moment in our history, and it was for a lot of fans who, I mean, you think of where we'd been. We'd won the league, I think, in 1926, and we'd won it in 38, and maybe earlier on the 30s, but for the best part of 30 years, we'd won 3 or 4 league championships. It had been beyond paucity, and then we go out and record this magnificent victory. But again, it wasn't a false dawn. It wasn't the promise of greater things to come. It was simply a one-off result. We beat Rangers, we beat them well, and we went back to form immediately thereafter.
And my particular favourite, which brings us up close to the time of the Celtic song, was the parody that they had on Harry Belafonte's Calypso hit Island in the Sun, which had the immortal beginning, "Oh Hampden in the Sun, Celtic 7, Rangers 1. That was the score when it came time up that Tim Alloys had won the cup." And
I'm glad you actually brought up Hampden in the Sun, Terry, because the origins to the Celtic song, there's a little bit of mystery surrounding them. Sort of hinted at in some corners that a guy called Mick McLaughlin, is that how you pronounce his name?
Yeah.
Known as Garngad Mick, who also wrote Hampden and the Sun, had something to do with writing the Celtic song. Is there anything you can tell me about that?
Well, first of all, Mick of Garngard was a well-known Glasgow figure and a wonderful lyricist, a wonderful parody writer. But I would have to go back just a wee bit to come back to that, if I may. In 1961, as I told you, my dad was touring with the White Heather Club. The two kind of leading lights in that were two Scottish singers, Robert Wilson and another guy who was up and coming at the time called Andy Stewart.
Oh, I've never heard of him.
He did a big hit with Scottish Soldier, which you may be familiar with.
Right, yep.
And then the comedy Scots song, Donald, Where's Your Trousers? So the White Heather group were a funny kind of group, because they could play the Carnegie Hall one week and the next week they'd be in a school hall, then they'd come back to Scotland, play a major theatre and then go to a village hall. So they were actually in Caithness in Scotland, and they were in a little town called Thurso, which is the most northerly town in Britain. And a guy approached my dad, his name was Dave Fahili, and he had a brother, Bill Fahili, and these two guys came from Coatbridge and Lanarkshire, great Celtic territory, and they were self-made millionaires, and they had made their money out of concerts, running dance halls and bingo promoters, but they were also talent scouts for recording companies. In fact, Dave Fahili was the first man to actually bring the Beatles to Scotland.
Oh, right, okay.
And he brought them as a backing group to another artist, and then he finally managed Dan McCafferty in Nazareth and the sensational Alex Harvey band, and was the owner of Impact Records. So when I approached my dad, he was a comedian. He only sang to go on the stage and off the stage. And his Bill Matter at the time was half Scotch, half Irish, half daft. 10 minutes a patter, 2 songs and off. So he was delighted at this opportunity. And the Fahili said, when you get back to Glasgow, Glenn, contact a guy called Clifford Stanton. He's got a shop in the Gallowgate called Glasgow Jazz Promotions. So during when Daly came home, he contacted Stanton, and he said, great to meet you, Glenn, blah, blah. We want you to do mainly Irish stuff, but the first thing we want you to do are 2 football songs. And he said, my dad was puzzled at this. What football songs? He said, well, the first one we want you to do is your Johnny Thompson song.
Right.
Which was obviously familiar to my dad. He knew that. It was a great traditional ballad in memory of John Thompson, killed at Ibrox in 1931 after the clash with Sam English. Now, the wee irony there was, Chris, that my grandfather had actually worked alongside Sam English in John Brown's shipyard.
All right, okay.
Sam English had been a young man in the sheet metal department of that yard, and he was well known as an outstanding player and a very, very nice guy, apparently. So that was the first song. So my dad said, well, what's the second song? He said, oh, the Celtic song. And my dad's first reaction was, what Celtic song? What Celtic song are you talking about? He says, you know the one I mean, Glenn? He says, that one, sure, it's a grand old team to play for. And my dad immediately recognised that line, and he remembered where he had first heard it. Where he had first heard it was in 1948, sung by the one and only Charles Patrick Tilley. And what had happened was, Tilley came to Glasgow in 1948, and he was an absolute sensation. His first Old Firm game, he ran absolute riot. He destroyed the Rangers' iron curtain defence. I mean, it was just unbelievable. The people took him at their hearts immediately, the green half of Glasgow anyway. It was Tilley mania, the Tilley ties, cocktails, Tilley ice cream, Tilleyisms. And Glasgow was a pretty bleak place in 1948, post-war. Rationing was still in force. And Celtic put him into a little hotel in Queen Street called the Kenilworth Hotel. So before long, Charlie had an entourage surrounding him, and they would go back to the Kenilworth, a few sandwiches and some beers, and Charlie would hold court with anecdotes and stories and gags. And then when thunder stories ran out, he would oblige the company and the kind of sing-song, which was the tradition of the time. And he always sang, it's a grand old team to play for.
Stop me if I'm wrong, Terry, but was that a different song completely? And the two songs sort of merged, is that right?
I don't know about that, but the key phrase that my dad remembered was a grand old team to play for. That was the thing that stuck in his mind.
Right.
And Charlie was obviously singing that in praise of Belfast Celtic. So when it came time to record the Celtic song in 1961, Daly remembered that, but he knew that it was only really a fragment. The tune itself apparently was based on a brass band melody of the early 1960s, the early part of the century, clear. But I would have to say that, in my opinion, and from what I know, that the credit for bringing the Celtic song to Glasgow was most definitely Charlie's. And I know that Belfast Celtic fans, aficionados, always mention the fact that the Celtic song was brought from Donegal Road to Glasgow by Charlie at that particular time.
Well, we were to win only 2 charity cups in 1958-59 and 1960-61 between the 7-1 game and the Scottish Cup victory under Jock Stein 1960.
Yeah. Aye, and there's nothing there. And at the end of the 50s, you've really got to think the club is in trouble. The club is in big trouble at that stage. Sir Robert Kelly is in charge of the club for 13 seasons, and he's going nowhere by 1960. The club are going nowhere by 1960. They have no money. If you go and look at the attendances Celtic were attracting at the start of the 1950s and the attendances they were starting at the end of the 1950s, the crowds just disappeared. I took a note of some of the games we played in the winter of 1950, just after New Year, and then the winter of 1959, just before the turn of the year. We played Motherwell in these games are all at Celtic Park. We played Motherwell at Celtic Park in 1950 and got 40,000 people at it, and we played them in 1959 and we got 25,000 people at it. We played Dundee at Celtic Park in 1950, got 25,000 people at it. Played Dundee at Celtic Park in 1959 and got 10,000 people at it. And the last home game of the 1950s was 13,000 people against Airdrie. And we weren't paying a lot of money to see our football at that stage either. So you'd a team who had gone nowhere for 4 decades, who were being out-supported by Hibernian quite comfortably, who were as relevant to the game as Hearts or Aberdeen, who had no money, had no way of actually doing anything significant or anything different. So where do you go at that stage? The fans have had enough. The fans have other things to do with their lives as well. You've got a decade of social choice, of different leisure opportunities coming into people's lives, and this tailing away of football isn't unique to Celtic. It's happening right across Britain. The great crowds of the 30s, the 40s and the early 50s are diminishing right across the country, and it leaves Celtic in a really, really dark place. And where do you go? But, well, the kids, maybe. You say, well, we've got no choice here. We've got to just go and sign some kids and hopefully turn a pound from selling the ones that we can sell. And Celtic sold players. They sold players throughout the 1950s. They sold promising young players like Clarendon, and others like Billy McNeil would have gone in time had things not picked up in time. But it was a dark time, and we could have just disappeared. We could have become just another Hibernian, really.
But again, the importance of Jock Stein can't be underestimated here, because when you look at Stein taking over as coach in 1957 to 1960, and when you hear some of the tales about the players that played under Stein for the second team, and then getting picked for the first team and going, what's this all about? And then you see those players developing and maybe getting into the first team and thinking, this is a whole different world. And then, of course, Jock Stein leaves with a discussion with Bob Kelly that there's nothing more he can do at Celtic.
Aye, you're right. And Stein's seen a wee bit of the game by this stage. He's been influenced by Hogan. He went to see the Hungarian team in 1953 at Wembley along with Hogan, and he's got his eyes open. He's a sponge for the game. He's tactically aware. He sees how things are done better at other clubs, and he instills this kind of tactical awareness and discipline into the players that he's working with at Celtic, and it has an impact in Celtic. As I say, at the time, you've got the likes of Clarendon, McNeil, and Murdoch and Chalmers all at the club, the beginnings of a great team. But at this stage they're simply young lads, and anything could happen to them. They could go anyway. But Stein eventually, as you say, he has to go. He has to get into management, and he did all right when he got into management. You know, he showed the promise that he had, and he did terribly well with Dunfermline and with Hibs, and Celtic just continued to plod on, and you know, without wanting to talk too much about what's been said to me about players who were there under Jimmy McGrory. I know that not everybody was pulling their weight, not everybody was respectful to what they were being told, that Jimmy McGrory was, to some or other extent, an empty jacket in the manager's seat because other people were picking the team and other people were organising things. So the club just rolled along. It was more like a bowling club than a professional football club. Things happened because, well, if nobody does things, something's still going to happen. And that's how Celtic Football Club were ticking along. So we have it at the end of the 1950s as a movement that has kind of run out of steam. Nobody really cares about it enough to say, look, I'm taking this thing by the scruff of the neck and I'm going to resolve all of the things that are wrong with it and I'm going to put it right. And you do that and then you tap into an enormous amount of potential. This is what Fergus McCann did ultimately in the mid-1990s, that so many people had just given up in the club and drifted away from it, but there was this enormous amount of potential, and it existed there in the 1950s, even though we're 35 years since we were a proper force in the game. The enormous potential of the football club still exists and is still there.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find.
When my daddy went to Milan,
he came back,
and he went to Milan to see them, and I always remember when he was going away, and they were all getting ready to go and all that, and I was greeting because my daddy was going away in a big plane, and I was thinking I'm not going to see him again and all that. They were going away with their Celtic tammies on and all that and their scarves. When they come back, he brought me back a doll that said Mamma Mia when you turned it upside down. And he brought my mum back a big statue, big statue of Lady of Fatima. Beautiful, and it stayed in her family right till she died. And stayed with her, and it's always sitting in her dressing table, always sitting in the chest of drawers and that. And I've always kind of followed Celtic. I'm not mad crazy about Celtic like my brothers and my daddy was and all that, but as they loved to see them win. And I think it's just because I grew up with Celtic, you know, and I feel part of the Celtic family because of that, and I always will.
In all the towns like Donegal or Marseille, Glasgow town is where he's bound to watch the famous hoops, cause he's a dedicated follower of Celtic.
The only Celtic memory was going to see Celtic play Morton at Capello. I was about 7 or 8, and I went with my old man. He used to have a laundry van, and him and all his mates used to fill the back of this laundry van. He used to drive it. And I mind as a wee boy sitting at the back with all these men drinking beer and whiskey. These men, no me, but them. It was a scorching day and it was absolutely packed, and I was dead frightened, and I was squeezed away down the front. That's where all the wee guys went, the wee 8, 9 and 10 year olds. And I don't know nothing about the game, but that is my earliest memory of being seeing Celtic. I thought it was absolutely amazing.
County Clare to Singapore or China.
My earliest memory of Celtic was maybe I would be when they won the European Cup. I was 5, and I remember having the Celtic strip and all that and going out and playing football, but no knowing how important that was. The streets were empty. 1967, I was born in 62, but I remember going in and my big brother Brian going absolutely mental and thinking, What's he gone that daft about? No appreciating what it was. And I'm a Celtic man because I think we are the finest club the world has ever seen. I think our supporters are second to none wherever we go, apart from fear and no foe. And I'll hopefully pass that on to my boys and them, their boys, and so it goes on.
Good evening. This is the BBC News broadcast for the 6th of June 1954 at 7. Sporting triumph. Roger Bannister made world history today at Effley Ground, Oxford, where he won the race of his life. For years he has dreamed of becoming the first man to run the mile in less than 4 minutes. And by Jove he did it. Despite a slight crosswind, he clocked excellent time. Thanks to his famous Bannister burst, he sprinted into the history books, skipping over the line at 3 minutes 59 seconds. In other news, a report was published today that correlates the smoking of tobacco with lung cancer. In light of this, you certainly won't catch Roger puffing on a Wills Woodbine before one of his races.
And even though this may sound like it's bordering on being even sacrilegious, when we look at some of the official histories of the club, the 50s are glossed over. They're romanticised because we won the Coronation Cup and because we beat Rangers 7-1, and everybody thinks back to those fantastic teams and Charlie Tully and all those guys. But when you actually go to read the truth of what happened during the 50s, it was probably one of the most disappointing eras. I know we complain and we talk about the barren 40s and the 80s and the 90s and stuff like that, but when you look at the quality of the players on the pitch, surely this has to be the decade where Celtic underachieved more than any other.
Well, I've got a stat for you. Celtic lost more games in the 1950s than any decade. They lost 159 games in the 1950s. This was a time when there were fewer games per season than there is since then, since the advent of European football. They lost 28% of all games they played in the 1950s, which is a huge portion of games, and it means that supporting your team in that decade means you see a lot of defeats. You watch these great players, you watch them dribble with the ball and score goals, but just lose and come away disappointed and disjointed. So it is definitively, I'm not going to claim to be covering the worst decade, because I think the 40s run it pretty close, but it is certainly the decade with the most defeats in it. As a football fan, we don't like defeats. Nobody likes defeats. And, you can't romanticise that. People watching their team in the 1950s pitch up because they want to see their team win every bit as much as you want to see your team win these days. And you can well understand how there's 10,000 people turning up to see Celtic lose to Ayr United at Celtic Park in the 1950s and the late 1950s, because it's not popular losing, and that's what we did more than anything else in the 1950s. We lost football games.
But still we had the manager in Jimmy McGrory, this huge figure in the history of the club. And he was manager from 1945 to 1965, and even after the 7-1 game, there was still 8 years before Jock Stein replaced him, but there doesn't seem to be any recollection of anybody calling for Jimmy McGrory's head.
No, but you wouldn't though, would you? Because Jimmy McGrory isn't the manager as you understand the manager to be today. He doesn't pick the team, he doesn't decide who to sign. He's, for all intents and purposes, club secretary. He turns up, he opens the front door 6 days a week. That's Jimmy McGrory's job. He is the meter and greeter of people. He announces the team, but that's the extent of it. So who's getting the sack? Sack Jimmy McGrory, and you bring in somebody else to open the door, to announce who the team is, to do the kind of menial tasks that Jimmy McGrory was being left to do. The board picked a team. The board decided who would sign for the football club and who would not sign for the football club. The board hired and fired scouts, hired and fired coaches, hired and fired football players, and decided all of these matters. So it would be wholly inappropriate to fire the manager or to call for the manager's head, because the manager is little more than a titular head, and the real tactical and football power resides in the board and in the person of Sir Robert Kelly, who, as I say, got it spot on in 1952, got it spectacularly right in the mid-1960s. I don't think I'm begrudging him any credit whatsoever, and because I've heard this straight in the face from Sean Fallon, who told me, look, this guy, Robert Kelly, was fundamental in everything that went right for Celtic when he was there, from the 1965 to when he died in 1971. And Sean Fallon says when he died, the club was never the same again. It lost its drive, it lost its focus. Jock Stein lost a big partner, and we were inevitably in decline as a result of his death. So he had huge things in his favour, and he played a huge role that unfortunately you're not going to allow me to talk too much about. But for a decade and more, he simply managed decline and unprofessionalism at the football club.
So that all sounds very depressing for everybody listening to this. I think the only way we can end this decade and this year is to talk about Tully Mania.
Well, Tully Mania, he's still the great figure. You watch Paddy McCourt type footballers and you immediately think of Charlie Tully and of Jimmy Johnston and the players, the archetypal Celtic player. I spoke to the Celtic historian Tom Campbell a couple of weeks ago, and he asked me who my favourite Celtic player was of all time, and I asked him the question back, and he said, look, it's got to be Jinky. It doesn't matter if he's the greatest player of all time or not. He's Celtic, he embodies Celtic. That on the ball ability is what we're about. That mercurial talent is what we're about. And Tully was the photo fit of that. Tully was the man that Jinky actually moved into and took over from, and he was the character in the team. He was the man that the fans liked to see on the ball. He was popular, but he was hero worshipped by the Celtic support, and he was an icon, and we like our icons. And I don't know if you've got kids or a family. I've got boys, and it's not until you see kids relate to footballers, and I'm very pragmatic about my footballer. How good's he? What's his? How much would I pay for him if he wasn't a Celtic right now? Because that's the value I attribute to him. What would we do if we had the money? I'm enormously practical about my footballers. Kids just love icons. Kids relate to icons, and icons in the football jersey allows you to build a support. It allows people to engage in it, allow kids to engage in it. And Charlie Tully was this huge, enormous icon at a time when that was pretty much all we had. We had one huge, enormous icon, and his name was Charlie Tully.
From 1950 to 1960, the Celtic home kit would change only slightly. The Celtic shirt was made up of our famous green and white hoops with a white collar, and white shorts were worn with green socks which featured two white hoops, one around the ankle and one just below the knee. The only change to the home kit was made in 1956 when we started to wear smaller shorts, this meaning that we no longer wore shorts which resembled three-quarter length trousers. The away kit from 1950 to 1960 would change only slightly again. From 1950 to 1958, our away shirt had a white front and back with green sleeves and a green collar, and this shirt also featured a green shamrock which adorned our left breast. This was accompanied with white shorts with a green trim down each side. Green socks were again worn with this kit, and these socks again featured two white hoops, one around the ankle and one just below the knee. From 1958 to 1960, a couple of slight changes were made to the away kit. Out went the green trim in the shorts to leave all white shorts, and the socks were changed to all white.
and the green and white upon my chest. It's such a joy for us to see.
In the 1950s, the ritual reading of the Saturday sports results was ingrained in the lives of the football public, as evening editions of newspapers across the land provided the final scores from matches around the country. On the night of Saturday, September the 20th, 1952, however, Celtic fans were reading the front page reports of a sad and tragic funeral in Cambuslang, a few miles from Celtic Park. Glasgow's Evening Times reported that Celtic stars Stein, Tully, Weir, Bowden, Evans and John McCrory had borne the body of fellow Celtic star John Jackie Millsop out of St Bride's Church as the funeral cortege travelled to Westbourne Cemetery, where he would finally be laid in rest. Ranger stars of the day, Sammy Cox, Tiger Shaw, Ian McCall and George Young also flanked the coffin as it made its sorrowful final journey. Jackie had been plucked from the junior football ranks while still a child of 16, starring at Blantyre Celtic, where he quickly fell under the spotlight of the Celts in Glasgow's East End. Junior forms were signed in 1947, and in 1948 Jackie was made full-time on the Celtic staff. He made his debut later that year in a 2-1 win over Clyde, and for much of the years to come, Jackie would be utilised as a talented utility man, learning his trade by deputising for the likes of Charlie Tully, Bobby Evans and Jock Weir. By 1952, however, Jackie was beginning to make his mark as a senior player, and at the end of the season, he took his place in the first team for a trip to Belfast to take on a Belfast Celtic select in a charity game in May of that year. On September the 6th, not long into the new season, Jackie was in the starting lineup to play Falkirk at Celtic Park, with stars like Sean Fallon, Willie Fernie and Big John MacPhail. Stadium flags hung at half-mast to mark the death of former Celt Frank O'Donnell, who'd been an effective centre-forward with the club in the 1930s, lining out with his brother Hugh. In the Falkirk ranks was a 38-year-old Celtic legend, Jimmy Delaney, who ploughed the wing at outside right. Jackie Millsop played a key role in Celtic's first home win of the season. Fernie and Tully both found the net, while Hookie MacPhail claimed a hat-trick of goals in the Celts' 5-3 victory. During the game, Millsop began to feel pains in his stomach, and afterwards he was rushed to hospital, where it was discovered that he had a ruptured appendix. Following an emergency operation, complications set in, and Millsop fell gravely ill. 2 weeks later he passed away, to the shock of the entire Celtic support and his teammates at Paradise. As the mourners filed away from Westbourne Cemetery, with the soil settling on the body of one of their own, most of those in attendance made their way to Celtic Park, where that same afternoon Rangers were beaten 2-1 in the Glasgow Derby. Jackie Millsop died aged just 22, another what might have been in the story of the famous Glasgow Celtic, and a man who remains forever in the hearts of those he left behind.
You know, Paul, like yourself, I never saw Charlie Tully play, but see this last year after doing the Belfast Celtic podcasts and studying the history of this decade and stuff, Charlie Tully's turned into my favourite Celtic player ever, and I've never even seen him play.
Well, that's right, for all those reasons. You know, he embodies the football club. The things that we like about a football club, we want to see in the characters that we choose. And we want to see this kind of player. Do we want to see John Gregg? Does that type of player embody Celtic? It doesn't embody Celtic. He's voted the greatest ever Ranger. He was a great player, was a successful player. He's not. It doesn't embody anything about the football club that you or I follow. Charlie Tully does. Jimmy Johnson does. Was Jimmy Johnson the greatest ever football player at Celtic? Well, maybe. McGrory has got a claim on it. Johnson's got a claim on it. Tully, maybe to a lesser extent, has got a claim on it. Dalglish has got a claim on it. Larson's got a claim on it. But this is how we want to view our football club, and Tully fits into that perfectly. He embodies what we want to think of ourselves, which is why we still talk about him, why Celtic pubs are still called Tully's.
You know, it's funny when you do these podcasts and you take a decade at a time, you always have one there who is that icon. Right from the Jimmy Quinns and the Jimmy McManamys and the Patsy Gallaghers, and here we are in the 50s when it was, well, let's say, not very good from a trophy perspective. We still had a Charlie Tully. And you think of the decade we grew up in the 80s and the 90s when it was terrible, we still had the likes of Paul McStay.
Aye, absolutely. You still have your great players, you still have your favourites. And it begs the question, it's why do great players not win as much as they should? We had the 1990s team should have won so much more than it did. The 1950s team should have won so much more than it did. It didn't. I think we understand the reasons why it didn't. But we had, if nothing else, we had Charlie Tully.
That's right. What a wonderful way to end the 50s.
Thanks very much, Chris. I really enjoyed it. It's given me a fresh perspective and appreciation for what it is to win football games as a Celtic fan. You know, we get so intolerant sometimes when we don't. We think it's our entitlement, which is always a dangerous thing to win trophies and to win trebles. Good grief. But you just got to understand our history, understand what the generations before us actually went through before the times turned and get good for them again.
It's just the hardships that the fans went through as well to go and watch a team. And in this modern age, when we complain about not being able to see live pictures from a friendly during the summer, you just feel you're spoiled a wee bit. And when we started to talk about this, we talked about the cattle boats coming over from Belfast and stuff, the hairs in the back of my neck were standing up, because they were the stories that I was brought up with. And then you look at the social unrest in Ireland and that being reflected in Glasgow, and then we talked about the flag and all that kind of stuff. And just the very fact that somebody told us we couldn't do that, and the club stood up and puffed out its chest and said, yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Paul, before you go, I have to ask you to nominate a charity that will benefit from the funds that are being raised by the Celtic History podcasts.
Well, we Celtic Quick News charity drive this year has heavily leaned towards 125 for 125, which I would encourage everybody to go and do something for, because it strikes to the heart of why we had a football club in the first instance. More importantly than that, it allows us to control where we go as a football club in the future and make sure that our founding reasons remain central to us. But I'd like to maybe just go beyond that on this one occasion, because I feel as though we've maybe there's a wee bit more we could do. The Quick Sergeant charity, which helps children and young people with cancer, got a wee turnout of us recently, but if people could contribute anything, then maybe on this occasion their monies could go in that direction.
Fabulous, Paul, and I'll read out all the details on that at the end of the podcast, and we'll put a wee link up from the site. And once we've done our 10, maybe 11 podcasts, we will make sure that we gather up all the cash and divvy it out and make sure that the charity benefits from it. Paul Brennan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on, and I know this can sometimes be a lot of homework for people too, but that was absolutely great. Thanks a million.
Thanks for asking, Chris. I enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you. Cheers.
There you are, folks. That's the end of chapter 6. Great stuff again, over 2 hours this week, and really enjoyed my time talking to Paul, and another decade in the bag, and so interesting again. So here's my thanks for this chapter. Obviously Paul Brennan from Celtic Quick News, Chris from the Paradise Report, the Human Torpedo, Joe Bloggs City from the Celtic Wiki, Pat from Half the World Away podcast, Stuart from the CelticShirt.co.uk, Terry Dick, of course, Kelly from Stonehouse, the Parrot for doing all the interviews, Padraig Coyle from the Belfast Celtic Society, Gary from Bristol for doing his interviews, the Wakes, Charlie and the boys for the music, Charlie Gallagher and John Fallon for the interviews, and to everybody else that sent in all the sound bites. But most importantly, thanks to everybody that has donated so far to the Celtic History podcast. In the 5 chapters that we've done so far, we've had about 10,000 downloads. We don't have 10,000 quid donated to the project, let me tell you that. Let's just say we're round about 10% of that. So come on, let's go to heelheelmedia.com, find the Celtic History podcast and donate a few pounds for all the charities that will benefit from it. Remember, if you still want to submit your soundbite, you can email them to lostboys@gmail.com. Dead simple. Record on your iPhone, record it on your Android, record it on your computer. Send me an MP3 file, a WAV file, anything like that, and we'll get you on the podcast. So next week, we catch up with the 60s. Yes, the swinging 60s. And we'll be talking about the 1965 Cup final. And then there was a small matter that happened in Lisbon. The start of 9 in a row, Jock Stein's team, all the stars. And joining me to do that, I'm absolutely chuffed to announce that Stephen Sullivan, who you probably heard in the Lost Boys podcast not too long ago, who was writing the Sean Fallon book, will be covering the 60s with me. And that is going to be fabulous. So one more time for luck, remember to go to heelheelmedia.com and follow the link to the Celtic History podcast, and you'll be able to make a donation. And remember, no one's getting paid for it. All the money goes to charity, and we really would like to donate something that's going to make a difference to the charities. Also follow the link from the blog on this chapter to Paul's chosen charity, and you'll be able to find out all the information about them there. So there we go, hope you enjoyed it. My name's Chris McGuigan, you're listening to the Celtic History podcast. Playing us out are your confessions. Cheers.
My Celtic confession would have to be in the very early 90s. I was taking my parents for a Chinese meal in Glasgow, and I got a shout that one of the boys shouted up and told me that a boy called Brian O'Neill was making his debut for the reserves that night at Lesser Hampden, and I got £20 out my wallet and put it on the living room table, and I sneaked away for a night, obviously before mobile phones, and vanished and went to the game, and then came home in the wee hours, a bit tipsy sort of thing. My mum and dad weren't best pleased, to be told. I was supposed to be paying for the meal. £20 didn't go too far the way they liked a wine list. God rest their souls. They're no longer with us, but Celtic are, and I'm sure they'll forgive me.
Favourite Celtic game was Smelrock Glove.
Okay.
I'll tell you a story about what happened. I actually worked in Celtic Park at the time, and I was supposed to go to Bark. Me and my pal, we had our uniforms on. We went in, signed in, as you do. We went up to the toilets and took our uniform off. Went and found a space, seat, wherever we crowded into, and it was probably the best weekend of my life ever experienced with Celtic. We just celebrated the whole weekend after that, and I never went back to Celtic Park to work.
We were beat 2-1 off Villarreal inside the Madrigal Stadium. So after the game we've left, and the locals are actually clapping the Celtic fans coming out the ground. And this big guy comes up to Tony. Celtic had just released a new jersey like the week before. Asked him to swap tops. Now, Tony's not the slightest of guys either, but this guy was massive. So we swapped jerseys, and Tony's put this Villarreal top on that must have been for like 1993. Had about 1,000 catches in it. He sticks that on. This fat guy tries to stick this new Celtic top on, which must have been a large, but honest to God, me and Tony were either side of him trying to pull this jersey around this fat guy, and it must have come up to about his belly button. I couldn't believe it. So he actually swapped him. I was like, you're after a nut, man. I think he drank too much.